Hello, welcome everybody.
Hi.
Hi. Glad to have you all here today for another program in our Saving Our Savannas program series. Grateful to have folks with us on Zoom as well. I'm Joanna Lalikas. I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement here at the Garden. So we're really so grateful to the Nature Conservancy for serving not only as advocate sponsors, but also as partners on program planning for the Saving Our Savannas series. Their connections to on the ground and in the field conservationists like Jeff, our speaker today, have been really instrumental in making this series, in my opinion, so successful. So now let me introduce our speaker. Jeff Marcus serves as a wildlife biologist for the Nature Conservancy in the North Carolina Sandhills. He has been working for Longleaf Conservation and Management for the past 22 years, 10 of those with the Nature Conservancy and about 12 of those with the Wildlife Resource Commission. He and his wife Ellen and 2 daughters serve as caretakers as well and preserve stewards for the Eastwood Preserve. So I'll hand it off to Jeff to talk about how important partnerships are to this work. Thank you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Joanna. Are you okay? Yeah, no, kind of an honor to be here as part of this. This Saving Our Savannah series has been great. For all of y'all who've been part of putting this together, I mean, you knocked it out of the park. This has really been a great combination of things that I've learned a tremendous amount, even after 22 years working in Longleaf. Had a lot of new things to learn. So today, I actually got to admit, I'm a bit more nervous than I usually am when giving a talk like this, because in large part, this isn't all my story here. I'm going to try and be faithful to those who live this experience and who are generous enough to share it with me, some of whom are in the room today and online watching. And so I had to apologize to them ahead of time for any errors and omissions and artistic liberties that I might take with it. But at any rate, I'll try and share with you a little bit about how in the Sandhills Conservation Partnership, we were able to move from conflict to collaboration, or my sort of working subtitle here, How Surfboards Help Save the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker. So this talk is not going to be heavy on the longleaf ecology or species biology. You've heard a lot of that from others' talks in this series, but I do want to introduce some of our key players here. So the red-cockaded woodpecker is an endangered bird, the only species in North America that drills cavities in living pine trees. So to have the conditions do that, it needs old growth trees, usually longleaf that are 80 years old or older, and it needs these very open savanna-like conditions for that when the bird's kind of swooping through. The forest has space and room to move. So those are some of the essentials about woodpeckers. Here's a video that shows the bird feeding the young. That's a young male, has that red patch. That'll be lost eventually when we guys play it one more time for fun. This video compliments of Brady Beck. The other key player in the story is Fort Bragg itself. Fort Bragg is a military training installation down in the Sandhills, home of the Airborne Special Operations Forces. Some people refer to it as the center of the military training universe. Has some of the highest throughput of training of any Army installation anywhere. As the saying goes, when the president dials 911, the phone rings at Fort Bragg. They've got units that are ready to deploy anywhere in the world in 18 hours notice or less. So there's this critical need for high-level training, and readiness to be constantly going on at Fort Bragg. The location, hopefully folks can maybe see the mouse, but we're in south central North Carolina here in the Sandhills. This large green polygon is Fort Bragg. It's recently been named Fort Liberty. That's the name we refer to it as now. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be calling it Fort Bragg because that's the name that everyone used for it during the time frame of the story that we're going to be talking about. So it's about 165,000 acres sprawled across 4 counties. And there's a satellite installation called Camp McCall, about 15,000 acres down here next to the 65,000 acres of Sandhills game land shown in light green. And these 2 large blocks of public lands kind of form the core of longleaf habitat areas and species populations in the Sandhills, with, in particular for the red-cockaded woodpecker, a subpopulation centered that was centered around Fort Bragg, and another population centered around the game lands. And this area in between the two that didn't have any conservation lands was known as the Gap. And we'll be revisiting that Gap area later. So every story needs a beginning. Ours will start in 1973 when President Nixon signed the latest iteration of the Endangered Species Act. Red-cockaded woodpecker was one of the first species listed on the original act. And it was the same year that a young fellow named Jay Carter came up with kind of a harebrained idea. He wanted to get into grad school, so he came with this notion, what if we went out and found all the red-cockaded woodpeckers and marked them and started studying them across the entire Sandhills? And someone told him, that's impossible, you won't be able to do that. So for Jay, it was like, okay, well, I'm damn well doing it. And so he set out, he found a professor willing to take some risks in the person of Dr. Phil Dorr at NC State University. They went out, got some funding, started getting things together. Around 1979, the project got off the ground in earnest when they went out and inventoried 400 square miles of the Sandhills. This is a huge area to cover, going across public lands, private lands, finding where all the woodpeckers were, starting banding these birds, getting this population marked. Their funding that they got was originally a 5-year grant, but in year 3, President Reagan decided that he was going to cut off all funding for endangered species work, and their funding was cut off. It was done. The story easily could have ended right there. But along came Dr. Jeff Walters, another professor at NC State, who said, well, what if we repackage this endangered species work, instead called it basic research on cooperative breeding ecology, and submitted a grant to the National Science Foundation, got funded. They're back in business, and they're off and running what has now become one of the longest running and most comprehensive wildlife studies anywhere in the world. It's a really amazing scientific achievement that we've learned a tremendous amount from from this study. So as they're going around the landscape and spending time, particularly in places like Fort Bragg, they're starting to see what a unique and special place it is. So they start inviting other biologists to come and survey and look and document to what is now known to be a nationally significant site for biodiversity of rare species and natural communities. And those of you who are reading the names on the bottom of that slide, we're going to be recognizing some of the ecology and conservation heroes and legends of North Carolina that were involved in a lot of this early work documenting things on Fort Bragg. So they were seeing lots of good there, but there's also reasons for concern. You know, back in this day, the forestry program, the foresters practicing fairly aggressive forestry practices, you know, have very sort of revenue set mindset. So they know that when a tree reaches a certain age, it's not putting on wood as quickly. It's time to cut it down and plant a new one, go quicker, give you more revenue over time. And we're doing timber operations that Jay Carter called a flat topectomy for going in and cutting out all these old flat top trees that were there. And then also, there wasn't much burning going on outside the impact areas on Fort Bragg. Very little fire, most of it in the dormant season. And when you don't burn in longleaf, you can see in this image on the right, this is a woodpecker cavity tree, but if you don't burn, it grows up in all this thick, dense hardwood mid-story, which kind of chokes things out. And even though the cavity tree is there, the woodpeckers will abandon it as they're not able to move through that habitat.
Just a quick,
Yes, sir.
impact areas where there was military activity going on that was causing fires, right?
That's right, yeah. So the question was military, and so this is actually one of the impact areas, McPherson, you know, a place where they're blowing stuff up all the time, and those are start fires, and so there's these frequent low-intensity fires that sustained an incredibly unique ecosystem in these areas. It's hard to get in there and study them because of all the unexploded ordnance, but you know, and these things were a little looser back then. Biologists could get around, and at any rate, you know, found what a neat place. So. Thank you for that question and clarification. So most of the problems really were attributed to the habitat for woodpeckers, but there were some issues related to military training. This structure that you see here on the left is some type of a structure built for military training, and worth noting is that the orange band on the trees, what was used to mark red-cockaded woodpecker cavity trees. And you can see this tree here that the structure was built with several cavity trees that were just cut down like any other tree to kind of build this structure there. In this image on the left, you can see the ground cover was torn up and trees skinned up from some military vehicle maneuvers. And in the image on the right, it's a view downrange of a small arms firing range. There was no berm behind it, and so when enough bullets skin up the edge of a tree, eventually kills those trees, and it's essentially decimated that forest back behind that small arms range. So you have these problems going on, but because of this research, because of things we're learning, we're actually learning how to better manage for red-cockaded woodpeckers. And actually, as early as 1991, Jeff Walters published a paper that essentially provided a new management paradigm for red-cockaded woodpeckers. I mean, these seem like sort of duh stuff for us now, but at the time, he said, you got to be burning, leave the old trees, use these artificial cavities, which are key limiting factor, use translocation where needed. Really not all that complicated. But when he brought these ideas to the foresters at Fort Bragg and at Sandhills Game Land, they said, we don't want any part of that. We don't want to grow our woodpeckers. We don't want to change our forestry operations. No thanks. He had to actually go elsewhere in the country to try and test and see some of these ideas. But with this study, we have data that can actually tell us, and because of all these problems and issues, we actually can realize, boy, things are going bad for woodpeckers. These birds are in trouble. So this was from sort of the initial start of the study in 1980 through the early 90s, just the decreasing percentage of active clusters on the left from Fort Bragg, and on the right data from Sandhills Game Land. So things are not going well for RCWs. But the real sort of pressure point crux that came in this was the 1990 Jeopardy biological opinion. So what that is, when the Fish and Wildlife Services issues a Jeopardy opinion, that's basically they're saying that you violated the Endangered Species Act and you need to stop that activity of what you were doing. So it's a pretty heavy-handed, serious act that happens under the Endangered Species Act. So in 1990, there was this opinion on Fort Bragg. Actually, just a year earlier, for context, there was a Jeopardy opinion issued for Fort Benning down in Georgia that involved, was around the timber operations that were happening there, but also there were some arrests from the commander who wanted to have a new range cleared for training. The biologist said no. In the middle of the night, chainsaws came out, dropped the trees, they got their range. Fish and Wildlife Service ended up arresting some contractors. There was a lot of bad blood and bad feeling and mistrust that was built from that and spilling over. And here in the Sandhills, you're starting to have these reports from the biologists who are on the ground, seeing what's happening on Fort Bragg, and then also a threatened lawsuit from the Environmental Defense Fund that eventually forces Fish and Wildlife Service's hand. They were reluctant at first to issue this, but then realized, okay, they need to act, and they actually issue two Jeopardy opinions, one around the timber program and the other around military training, which is really the one that got most of the attention. Meanwhile, from the Army's perspective, this was the same time frame when troops had just returned from successful operations in Desert Storm and Grenada. There were actually parades for the troops, celebrating their accomplishments and kind of the review of the actions. They recognized the critical role that training plays for making these troops effective and staying safe. So they're coming home feeling heroes, only to then be told, y'all are doing bad, you need to stop that training stuff. So from the Army's perspective, this was a real kind of shock to the system. And in fact, this Jeopardy opinion didn't stop all training, but many training activities did have to be altered or halted. These signs started going up, of restricted areas in the perimeters around where cavity trees that really limited the activity that could happen there. And this newspaper clipping from the time kind of shows the public sentiment and mood at this, where you see the story about it, and a picture of a red-cockaded woodpecker with a target and crosshairs around it. And this, in fact, is reflected in, if you look at some of the newspaper clippings from this time span of, lots of instances of, here we have, red-cockaded woodpecker is bound for extinction. Why can't federal officials accept that fact, stop fiddling with private property rights, military training areas, and the laws of evolution? Woodpecker keeping the Army at bay. So all this, there are very real and significant impacts that were happening to military training. But it was also interesting that the woodpecker was sometimes used as a scapegoat. There was a story about in the early 90s where the Alabama National Guard unit came up to Fort Bragg to train on one of the ranges there, and they were not very good guests. They left a lot of trash behind, left a mess, were kind of rude. And so the next time that this unit was scheduled to come up there, it just so happened that the range was closed, and the reason that was given was due to RCWs. Well, this caused a big stink in certain media circles. This became a topic on the Rush Limbaugh show. Senator Jesse Helms was railing about this as an example of just the Endangered Species Act and what it's doing to the military. But what didn't get as much attention is that a short while later, the range quietly just opened back up, and no more RCW problems happened to be raising their head. And there wasn't as much, or really any publicity or announcement about it the way the closure got, but those who were able to kind of observe and see what was happening on Bragg recognized that, at least in this instance, it was less of an RCW problem and more of an Alabama National Guard problem. So you have all this going on Fort Bragg, and meanwhile, on private lands, you have a severe mistrust that's out there, that private landowners who fear government regulations, they worry that endangered species move in, their property value is going to drop, they're going to lose that opportunity to gain revenue from their timber, some of them making their living off of it, real level of concern. Some advice from the National Association of Home Builders. Here was, they say, the highest level of assurance that a property owner will not face an Endangered Species Act issue is to maintain the property in a condition such that protected species cannot occupy the property. This is referred to as the scorched earth technique. That's in their developer's guide, published in 1996 there. Ben Cohn was a landowner who really became sort of, the face of this landowner opposition, and sort of ironically, he was in that position because he was a good land steward who left some of his trees and had red-cockaded woodpeckers, one of the few landowners who still had RCWs on his land still, and felt like he was being punished for that now by these restrictions. But anyway, there would be these landowner meetings sponsored by NC State Cooperative Extension that were described as being like Baptist revivals, where Ben Cohn would be up there, pounding his fist on the lectern and scream about, the fire and brimstone of endangered species and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and getting landowners very riled up and upset by this. And so, again, reflected in kind of the mood of the time, some titles out there, the, articles, Death to Woodpeckers, landowners say they, not the birds, are endangered. Forget woodpeckers, put people first for a change. And lots of examples of where people would be cutting their longleaf trees before they could become infested with woodpeckers, or before anyone would come and find out they had woodpeckers, to avoid those kind of endangered species restrictions. So that was the mood on private lands at the time. So we have this problem, and we need to address it. And one thing about a jeopardy opinion is it requires the parties to find an alternative to the action that was causing the effect. So as we talk about that, I want to introduce you to some of the key players. Now, maybe this is not everyone. There were a lot of others who were involved, but as I talk, I want you to see some of the folks who we're going to be dealing with here. So Mike Lynch was head of training operations at Fort Bragg at the time. Sam Hamilton was a assistant regional director out of the Atlanta office for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Scott Farley was an Army lawyer and Belfit, an Army biologist, both seen here looking at some scat on the ground. They were associated with what was at the time called Army Environmental Center, now the Army Environmental Command. Fred Anand, those of you who are here in the room are in the presence of a legend. After 44 years, having protected over 400,000 acres of land, that's another story. He's a key figure here. Paul Teese was also with Army Environmental Center. Bert Bivings was with ForceCom. Ralph Costa was a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist and the RCW recovery coordinator at the time. And then a little bit later in the story, we're gonna meet Pete Campbell from Fish and Wildlife Service and Tad Davis, who was the garrison commander at Fort Bragg. So we have the start of the Sandhills dialogue, and now actually in fullness of there's sort of multiple dialogues that were happening. One around military training issues, another around the private lands initiative, another around safe harbor program. And in the interest of sort of conciseness for this talk, you're going to get a little bit sort of conflated and here, but I think a lot of these principles will apply well to talking about all of them, but specifically the meetings around the military training issue. First meeting was down in Atlanta in 1994, bring together the Army, Fish and Wildlife, and all these people to try and address the issue. And it was described as they first got together, it was like a group of male dogs, circling each other, sniffing, snarling, a lot of mistrust, feeling each other out, not uncertainty, and then as the meetings got started, they literally had to take breaks every 20 minutes to avoid being at each other's throat. People were getting so upset and worked up, and they just, all right, take a break, calm down, each go to your corners and mutter about the other side of what was going on there. They were dug into their positions. So for the Army, it's national defense is at stake. We're here to train soldiers, not to raise birds. It's an existential threat to us. We're going to fight on that. And for the Fish and Wildlife Service, it's the extirpation of a species at risk. The law is the law. It's an existential threat for us, and we're going to fight and be dug in. And between those two positions, there's not a lot of space for talking and dialogue about it. And further complicating it, you didn't actually have all the right people in the room and at the table at the time. So for instance, the training lands in Fort Bragg were run by the engineering division at the time. And so it was the engineers at the table. Actually, the trainers were told they're not allowed to speak during these discussions. And engineers not only don't know a lick about red-cockaded woodpecker biology, they didn't even also know about the training needs and the training things. So you have a situation where stakeholders just didn't understand each other's needs and constraints, didn't speak the same language, didn't have the right people at the table. It's not going well. And our consequences for failure were pretty steep. The status quo was seen as untenable for military training and the need for national security. Senator Jesse Helms had threatened, actually I think he introduced a bill to exempt all military installations from the Endangered Species Act. Those of you know, DoD facilities across the country are really treasure troves of biodiversity. Would have had a significant impact. There were even efforts underfoot to alter or completely repeal the Endangered Species Act. And the Fish and Wildlife Service could have convened their God Squad, which is a group of high-level folks that can essentially make a decision to allow a species to go extinct if the cost and consequences of recovery are too high. These all seem drastic, but these were very real possibilities, many of which easily could have come to pass. But how do we get past this? How do we crack this nut? How do we solve it? And again, at the risk of oversimplifying things, I'm going to tell sort of one story thread that maybe exemplifies, which is that Fred Annand from TNC, Scott Belfit, and Scott Farley from the Army happened to share an interest in surfing. Who knew? So now they have something to chat about during the breaks and after the meetings. And actually, as time went on, they sort of had an uncanny ability to subtly influence where some of the next meetings would take place, perhaps close to the beach, where they'd happen to show up with a surfboard in the back of the truck. But they start forming, a friendship and a mutual respect. And if I can, fast forward just a couple of years to tell one story to illustrate it, they took a surf trip down to Sebastian Inlet in Florida. This was not a work trip, this was a personal trip. But anyway, Scott Farley and Scott Belfit were going to travel down from Maryland Army Environmental Center to meet Fred in Chapel Hill, pick up his trailer, load the gear, and meet Pete Campbell and Burt Biddings and go for the thing. But when the Scotts get to Chapel Hill, Fred's trailer is broken and it's loaded with manure. So they have to now fix the trailer, unload all the manure, feed Fred's mules, and Fred loads the gear back in the trailer without cleaning it out first. They get on down to Florida, and conditions are miserable. It's cold, it's wet, the surf is bad, raccoons keep getting into the food and gear. On Pete Campbell's first run, he gets injured, the board slamming into his leg. In this picture, Scott Belfit's pointing to Pete's blood on the surfboard there. So by all accounts, an ill-fated trip. But at nights, kind of sitting around the campfire, drinking beers, having a chance to talk about, all right, what got you motivated to get into this line of your career in the first place? What were the values you learned from your parents? Just learning more about each other and just developing this true respect and friendship. It really created this bond. And so how does this now affect our negotiations? Well, all of a sudden, you're not sitting across the table from an enemy or an adversary, but someone you respect. And, there's you're invested in each other's success. And just kind of one example of sort of the changing tone and mood. There was a meeting. People were kind of talking past each other and along very well. And Fred had everyone stop and say, all right, I'm going to go around the table and just say, what is important to you? What do you need to get out of this process? Really to understand and make sure that everyone was listening and understanding so that everyone felt heard, everyone felt understood, and start trying to build from there. Okay, so we got some building blocks to start building trust in these different dialogues. And again, as a reminder, this was an antagonistic relation, not just between these organizations, but there were individuals. So, Mike Lynch, he had a training, had a Fish and Wildlife Service enforcement officer read him his Miranda rights over a wetland issue, on Fort Bragg. A very extremely negative, experience for him personally. But when he took over the negotiations for the Army, this actually ended up being a really positive thing, because instead of going into it with a chip on his shoulder, he came in thinking, how do I solve the problem? And he also, further, he had the understanding of what the training needs were, so he knew what outcomes really were needed to kind of get to it. So you're starting to get the right people at the table. He needed a partner on the other side for this, and again, there was some increasing pressure from the White House and the Pentagon and others. You got to fix this problem, and so Fish and Wildlife Service now sends up Sam Hamilton to take over negotiations. He had experience working with endangered species out west, and he's also very pragmatic in thinking how we can create some solutions. So, kind of an example of this, within these the clusters of cavity trees where all. The baseline was like, all right, no activity in there, really no training. You just kind of have to work around it, can't have realistic training. They said, well, what if we actually create some recruitment clusters to start, getting more birds on the landscape, and we ease some training restrictions at some of our clusters and leave them in place in others and be able to study those results and better understand what really is the impact there. So now you're building some trust because you're allowing some training activities to resume in some places, and you're increasing our understanding of what truly is needed for the birds. Okay, making some progress. There's another incident. Mike wanted to conduct a movement to contact training, and under the rules at the time, he had to actually call down to a biologist in Atlanta to get permission to do training. So he calls up biologists, says, hey, I want to do movement to contact through some RCW clusters. Hey, can I do that? And the biologist looks, no, I don't see that on the list. That doesn't sound real good to me. No, you can't do that. And instead of blowing up or get frustrated, Mike pauses a beat and says, do you know what a movement to contact training is? So he invites the staff from Fish and Wildlife Service up to Fort Bragg and puts on a demonstration where they show a group of soldiers moving surreptitiously through the forest until they can identify where the enemy is, and they set up an ambush. And the biologists are like, oh, you're just walking through the woods. Yeah, you can do that. And there was sort of aha moment. Oh, we're not speaking the same language. We don't even understand what we're talking about with each other. So Paul Teese comes up with this idea of let's put on an Army 101 training. So this is for partners of the Army who can come and learn about sort of what the Army does, why they do it, the language that's used, so that when you work and interact with the Army, there's this better shared understanding. And it went in both ways other, that these trainers and grunts are now all of a sudden having to learn about red-cockaded woodpecker biology and habitat. So starting to learn the language, learn the needs of each other. The next real key breakthrough came with the private lands initiative. So one problem is you have this finite resource. There's just a certain amount of area in Fort Bragg for the woodpeckers and for military training. The green suits in the room, is called some of the military brass. They were going to fight for every square inch, on Fort Bragg, and that was going to have to be, where that was. And Fred and Scott, they go rogue. They realize that this is not going to be solved here. We need to increase the size of the pie, and really that the only solution is a landscape solution. If you can actually protect habitat and birds off the base and then add to the recovery and recover the broader population there, it'll then help us to get to a point where there's enough birds to remove restrictions on the base by protecting land off the base. So this was actually a big mind shift. Military needed to start thinking outside the fence line before there's only sort of inside the fence line. Then as he started looking at this idea, Paul Teese helped identify the gap as one of those critical areas. If you could link those two subpopulations, all of a sudden you have a bigger population, more counting towards recovery, and they're more secure. Scott Farley had to do some creative lawyering. Basically, this is something that the Army had never done before. So he finds a way to justify the program using an obscure clause of the Sykes Act. And this was a really critical thing because often lawyers will find every reason for you not to do something. So when you find someone who's really saying, how can we make this happen, and where do we really find the way to solutions, it was a critical step. But the Army needed to take a leap of faith for them to spend money off the base buying land that was not training lands. That was not anything they'd ever done before. Fish and Wildlife Service had to take a leap of faith to allow these red-cockaded woodpeckers, particularly off the base, to count towards the Fort Bragg recovery goal. They say is sort of letting Bragg off the hook for the work they should be doing on Fort Bragg. So everyone's got to sort of move a little bit outside their comfort zone. But meanwhile, we do have this shared threat that they both have about encroachment of development on the base. This image that you see here, that red line is the Fort Bragg boundary with the base to the north and private lands to the south. And that big sort of rectangle there is St. Mary Glee's drop zone, a place where they parachute out people and equipment. And within just a short amount of time, a few years, all of a sudden this big subdivision popped up right on the edge of the boundary. And if the wind was wrong, then you might have some paratroopers end up landing on people's houses or in their swimming pools. Neighbors are complaining about the noise and the things, and eventually the Army actually had to stop and shift, discontinue a lot of the training activities that were happening on this drop zone. And meanwhile, the Army has a process called Base Realignment and Closure, or BRAC, which is where they identify facilities that are no longer able to meet the training mission, could be closed or shuttered or activity moving elsewhere. So Bragg's identity as the center of the training universe is really now kind of at threat. So you have a situation where the Army's saying, well, wouldn't that land have been better as a longleaf forest rather than a subdivision? But the Army, because of some regulatory things, they got plenty of money in hand, but they can't buy land. They don't have the trust in the community and such. TNC has the ability to go out and buy land and protect it. We don't have much money. Here's an opportunity to actually come together and have a win-win. So that's how the private lands initiative was born. But now we need to show it can work. We need to show some success. It's taken a little bit of time, but there's pressure mounting. The Pentagon doesn't really like this idea. A lot of people who want to see it fail. There's a number of skeptics out there. There's a time limit on the money that's available. But we didn't have relationships in the community. Didn't have trust. A lot of these landowners are kind of reluctant, a little skeptical. And this is where Fred Annan's skill set of his charm, his ability to sort of build relationships. And eventually, he was able to reach a deal with a landowner who was nicknamed Mean Gene the Clear-Cut Machine, and protected the 550-acre Rosie Tract, pictured below here. And they got the first one under the belt. And just so happened that someone who was involved in these things knew the Deputy Undersecretary for the Army, invited them down from the Pentagon. They came sort of. Turns out that he happened to be a birder. Didn't have a red-cockaded woodpecker on his life list. Oh, here's a chance, go to a woodpecker tree. Brady Beck sort of scraped the side tree of the pine cone, and out pops not a woodpecker, but a flying squirrel. Like, oh man, this chance to see it. But anyway, he apparently, this Deputy Undersecretary had a great time. Thought this was a great sort of project. Wrote a memo that provided a lot of that political cover that was needed to continue. A number of other stories of like near misses of that program keeping going. But so we're starting to address some of these issues around the public lands, but what about the private lands? So again, we have a group of folks that need to start thinking outside the box in the traditional ways. And in this case, it's again Dr. Jay Carter, who you met previously, along with Robert Bonney and Michael Bean from Environmental Defense Funds, were some of the key progenitors to come up with this idea, which was really kind of pretty simple, that if a landowner is going to manage their land in a way that's compatible with red-cockaded woodpeckers, they would then be exempt from endangered species restrictions for any new birds that move in. So you do good things, you leave your trees, you do some burning, you have new birds that come in, or your existing group expands and you need to cut some timber to send your kid to college, you can do that under this program. So if your landowner, you're still responsible for the baseline of basically however many birds were there when you first enrolled in the program. So this again was a very novel, risky idea for Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, a lot of these institutions don't like change, don't like inertia. This is a program that really is more beneficial to landowners than it is to the birds. But in being implemented, it's been hugely successful, and has been so because almost instantly it removed that fear of that loss of your property value, the ability to make your living. You don't have to worry about it. You're building trust, and key also building relationships. That there's biologists that go out and meet with landowners once a year. Something that Lydia's going to start doing soon. That has a chance to start talking with these landowners, talking about their birds, about opportunities for management. Again, just sort of building relationships that in turn would often lead to opportunities for land protection through that private lands initiatives. Now we're starting to see some real synergy between these different pieces of the puzzle come together. We're making progress here. Good things are happening, even like just some small, subtle things like let's build some berms behind our shooting ranges, protect the trees behind it there. Or where we do have RCW trees in the way, we'll give them bulletproof vests so that they won't get shot up. Kind of more critically, bigger things, when Colonel Davis, Tad Davis comes, he institutes some major changes to the environmental division, which had a lot of problems before, helped create the endangered species branch. Colonel Davis put an emphasis on habitat and cavity work, something that really wasn't being emphasized before. And what he said is that before the mission was just training. Now the mission included recovery, because he understood not only their federal obligation to do so, but the path to training, recover the birds, that will then alleviate the training restrictions and can get back to what we need to do for training. So now this is part of the Army's mission, and if nothing else, the Army's very mission driven. When they got a mission, they're going to go do it. Key thing on the Wildlife Resources Commission side, we sort of moved from the era of Norman Lentz and Harlan Hall to now we had Bill Parsons, who took over as forester, and really key was Brady Beck, a true Renaissance man who took over the lead for the red-cockaded woodpecker work and helped bring about changes to the forestry program there, to where now Sandhills Game Land really is the model for how to do ecosystem management at scale. And so a lot of key factors. And then those advances that Jeff Walters had started talking about back in the early 1990s are now being adopted. The use of these artificial cavities, filling one of the most limiting factors. Managers are starting to learn how to use grow in season fire, cutting out mid-story. So go to a case where, again, you have a woodpecker tree here, and then you kind of get out that mid-story out of the way, start burning, and it looks a little more like that. And there's a saying in the habitat restoration world, build it, they will come. Well, Jackie Britcher described how they cleared out an area where they cleared out all this hardwood mid-story, and then just a couple weeks later, showed up a group of military trainers having a training exercise inside the area. So shoo them off. This is an endangered species. You got to get out of here. And then so a couple weeks later, there was another site that they cleared, and shows up another group of troops doing training, and they had this aha moment. Oh, this is what military training habitat looks like. That for the trainers, this was easier to see, easier to walk through, fewer ticks and chiggers. That it was actually beneficial from the military training side of things. And so now you've gone from sort of competing over different interests to now, boy, we can actually both meet our interests from the same outcome and having a win-win, and that's gold when you can get to there. So we've now got all these great things coming in place. There's a need to sort of formalize this, create a formal framework. So Pete Campbell from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, seen here, he was in charge of the Safe Harbor program at the time. He started looking at the Sandhills landscape based on the biology of the species, not on land ownership boundaries, not on other things like what's needed ecologically here, and recognizing the needed cooperation of more partners to help meld these private lands and public lands efforts for a regional recovery strategy. So part of his Natural Resource Leadership Institute project, he creates the Sandhills Conservation Partnership. So he's got to get the right people to the table, the right partners. So he starts off with this initial group of 9 partners as part of this formal partnership. But it wasn't easy at first. Again, there's a lot of mistrust that's still out there. Even this is in the year 2000. So you got to overcome these years of mistrust. One thing they do is they develop an internal communications plan, so that how they're going to talk within, to each other, and how making sure that every partner is heard and has a voice, understand each other's viewpoints. What was kind of uncanny is Jeff Walters told me a story that almost exactly mirrored the one from Fred's meeting, not having had been there, but there was a meeting where Jeff Walters, he'd been like reading about partnerships and why they fail, and one reason they can fail is hidden agendas. And so he told people like, all right, stop out and like go around, tell us, what do you need to get out of this? What are your interests in this? Using almost the exact same language, and had everyone sort of speak to it. So all of a sudden people are feeling heard, people are being understood. We can start understanding each other's interests, so we can now focus on those shared interests, and then also to celebrate those shared accomplishments. It was important that this all work be driven by sound science. So the partnership developed a habitat prioritization map called the reserve design, took an ecosystem approach that considered not just the endangered species, but also game and non-game species needs. And the longevity of this partnership has been due to a number of factors. A lot of it's been the continuity of both the organizations and individuals who are on, people who've made long-term commitments and been in it. They created an atmosphere of kind of just, this is how it's done. There's been a generational handoff, that as one group of people have retired, the next generation has been brought along, to understand those leadership positions, the stories, attitudes. This picture that you see on the right, they created actually a shared workspace, the office in downtown Southern Pines, at the time housed Army Environmental Center, Sandhills Area Land Trust, TNC, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they learned to kind of evolve and adapt, that the partnership was not going to be static. They were going to kind of learn from their lessons learned. And as involved, and these are the partnership has grown into a sort of a large information sharing forum. These are all the entities that are engaged and involved in some level in the partnership today. And the partnership has been managed to direct things that happen on the ground. So around land management, there's these collaborative grants that happen through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that bring funding to multiple partners and shared resources. Partners are now sharing staff and equipment and training and information across property boundaries, whereas in the past that just used to happen like in a silo just on one property of themselves. We have some new climate resilience projects underway that are working across the landscape. The partnership has helped to facilitate some of the research and monitoring so that we better understand not just red-cockaded woodpeckers, but other elements of this ecosystem. This helped to support land use planning, such as the Green Growth Toolbox, which provides data and recommendations to local governments and land use planners, a program run by the Wildlife Resources Commission. And they've really transformed the landscape. So again, here's that map that we saw of Fort Bragg, Camp McCall, and the game lands. All these purple properties are lands that were protected from that private lands initiative, and the subsequent programs that followed from it. About 25,000 acres protected, helping to buffer the base, helping to fill in the gap between these places. And these successes on the ground started leading to a lot of changes in attitudes of the public. This is a political cartoon that appeared in the paper in 2002, illustrating the unlikely partnership between TNC and the Army. Interesting, just a few years ago, the city of Fayetteville got a baseball team, and they had a contest, to name the team, and they ended up choosing the name the Woodpeckers. And the press release announcing it, they talked about how not only how like red-cockaded woodpeckers are unique and special to the area, but how like the toughness and the resilience of the bird is representative of that of the community. And so now all of a sudden, these woodpeckers are being embraced as a symbol of, of good by the community there. And again, you look at the articles that start showing up. It's now a different tone. Army and birds live in harmony. And the birds were starting to do well. This is the 40-year data set starting from 1980, just for Block A on Sandhills game land. You can see that kind of that dip to below, and then the increase up to as a significant increase through them. This is data from the Sandhills as a whole, just from back in 2002, when a lot of these initiatives were already underway. Just you can see the significant increase in the number of woodpeckers across the landscape. And it was back in 2006 when actually crossed the threshold of exceeding the recovery goal for the species, about 5 years ahead of what was projected because of all this effort and initiative that was going on. So this partnership and then all these efforts, what have been the accomplishments of it? Well, that private lands initiative became the Army Compatible Use Buffer Program, which in turn became what's known as the REPI program now, which is extended to all Department of Defense facilities across the entire United States, responsible for over 1.2 million acres of land protected around military bases. Safe Harbor is now a nationwide program covering dozens of species and many hundreds of landowners. The partnership itself is a model for how to do business. When the America's Longleaf Initiative tried to sort of set its strategy for recovering longleaf across the range, they looked at the Sandhills partnership and said, we want to do it that way. We want to look for places where there's partners working collaboratively at a landscape scale, and we're going to call those local implementation teams, and those are going to be the units at which we'll focus and funnel funding and other resources to get longleaf restoration done. It's been over 40,000 acres in total, with the acres included among those in the Sandhills since 1999. I conservatively counted at least $200 million worth of land protection and management just from collaborative projects, not stuff that partners would have been doing individually, but it involved like multiple partners working together. So just a lot of leveraging of resources. Partnership helps support the First in the Southeast Prescribed Burn Association. Stood up the Regional Land Use Advisory Commission, kind of an innovative approach, a way to reach local governments. And as I mentioned, the recovery of the woodpecker has been one of the big accomplishments, reaching that recovery goal in 2006 and actually linking those east and west populations to us now one unified population that happened in 2017. And meanwhile, this is what success looked like for the Army, that once we reached that recovery goal, all of a sudden they could take those darn restricted area signs off the trees and toss them in a dumpster and go back to training across the landscape in a realistic way, in the way that they wanted to. So they were getting their interests met. So it's really kind of a remarkable story of what we came to. And what I want to close with is looking at what can we learn from all this? What lessons can we glean about what were those enabling conditions that allowed us to make that kind of success happen? And one of the first that I come up with is that it does sometimes take some external pressure, some uncomfortableness, a crisis, to set things in motion. If there's not a crisis point or a need, if you feel need for change, nothing is going to change. So as the saying goes, in every crisis, an opportunity. So always look for that. And that there actually is a role for regulations and lawsuits. That in some political circles, environmental regulations get a dim view, but without the Endangered Species Act, there's not a requirement to protect red-cockaded woodpeckers, and a lot of this work that has now been so critical for all these species associated with the longleaf ecosystem may not have flowed from it. And also others don't really care much for environmental groups that sue to get things done. But again, without that threat of a lawsuit, perhaps none of this gets set in motion. So there is a role for the agitators as well as the negotiators in environmental issues. Always important to understand the interests of your adversary. Don't go into a negotiation just focus on here's what I want, here's what I need. Take the time to understand what is your opponent looking to get out of this, and really focus on interests, not positions. And what I mean by that is a position is sort of like a rigid, here's the what I want here, and the interest is more of like, here's why I want that. This is all sort of articulated in this book, Getting to Yes. Just to kind of give you an example from another area of it, a position might be, we should end all fossil fuel extraction in the interest of climate. And another position might be, drill, baby, drill. And from those two positions, there's actually not a lot of room for discussion, negotiation. If I win, you lose, and vice versa. But if you can articulate, maybe we actually have a shared interest in having reliable energy sources, and maybe a shared interest in having clean air and clean water, and perhaps can agree that supporting rural jobs and economies is important. Well, now there's still difficult decisions to be made, but you've opened up some space to actually discuss ways that we can maybe meet multiple interests. So look for those overlapping interests and try to focus as much on those overlapping interests, but also provide an appropriate forum to discuss the divergent interests so that you're not just brushing conflict under the rug. Those personal relationships, we found out, it's not just organizations, not faceless, names, badges, it's people that make these things happen. So finding the common ground, seeing the humanity and other stakeholders, really exemplified by Fred and the Scots and the work they do. Seen here on a trip to Hawaii, which work trip might be seen as another surfing boondoggle event. Great surf, as I understand, on this trip here. But actually, this was a really critical, important part where they were able to educate, in Hawaii, where they're having some major conflicts about the values of the ape program, which led to the protection of some really biologically critical land next to some military installations and benefits to the military there, to where they're really celebrated and feted. And this image that shows them, also kind of illustrates, how this sentiment was really passed on. Here, second, this is Nancy Natoli, who was working just simply as a contractor for REPI at the time, but having learned from them and this, she actually went on to become the head in charge of the REPI program that helped to sort of implement and promote it farther beyond. So, as you're building these relationships, some things to keep in mind. It's always important to do what you'll say you'll do. Be good to your word, follow through always. A quote that I heard from a speaker recently I really liked is that trust is built in teaspoons full and lost in buckets full. So another lesson, there's need for risk taking, need for a leap of faith. All these people that you see pictured here and many of the others in this had to push back, not even just against those on the other side, but actually within their own organizations, pushing back against the inertia and risk averseness to be able to try something new and be willing to take a leap of faith and be willing to risk failure in order to make something new happen. It was critical to bring the right people together, people at the decision-making level as well as the implementers, so that you can make informed decisions, in this case around real-life military training needs as well as the best conservation science in conjunction. Be willing to give as well as get. You're not going to get everything. You're going to have to do that. But success breeds success. Each success, builds more trust and more momentum. So pursue little wins first and then keep building on that. And also find important community leaders. This is a landowner, Julian Johnson, seen here with Susan Miller, who was critical in that safe harbor program for many years and with the partnership. But Julian, he was a landowner. He made his living off the land. He cut timber, he raked pine straw. He was a little skeptical and reluctant at first, but eventually he enrolled in the safe harbor program, and he became a model for how you can manage land to both generate revenue and support habitat. He became a real spokesperson for the community. His neighbors saw what he was doing. That built sort of trust and understanding, and so then more neighboring properties ended up going forward. So those community leaders can be really critical. And the partnership, I think, taking a comprehensive approach, not being focused just on one species or just on one issue, but looking at both private lands, public lands, game and non-game, all aspects of protection management and land use planning. And finally, I want to close with speaking directly to kind of the students and young professionals that are here and on Zoom today, to say that this whole storyline of a seemingly intractable problem with two sides that can't get along and don't really like each other and significant consequences for failure, that might seem a very uncomfortably familiar storyline for issues that we see today. But it's important to know that you can make a difference. The actions of one individual matter. That in this story, there were just a few individuals that through their actions made this change. If you, at the start of all this, if you said, we're going to be able to change the culture and policies of such a large and intractable institution as the U.S. Army, basically you're crazy. You're not going to do that. But a few people did that. Individuals can make a difference. Thinking about commitment to long-term relationship building and sustained effort. Something I see. I've seen the trend a little bit of people are sort of bouncing from job to job to job, and that's something that's perfectly appropriate and actually a good thing to do kind of earlier in career. But as your career goes along, be thinking about where's that time and that place where you feel like you can get settled into a place where you can really sink your teeth into. What are the problems? What are the issues? What are the relationships that you can build? And I think you'll find that after year 10, there are problems that you can solve and things you can do that can't get done just after year 1. And it is important to know that intractable problems can be solved. And in the words of Scott Farley, if you don't have the world that you want, create the world that you want. And so this is the legacy that we inherit. For all of you that work in conservation in North Carolina, this is our, we've exported this to the rest of the country following our model. We have all these programs and institutions in place because of this effort. We have these shoulders of giants to stand on, and so how far will you see from that, and how far will you go? And with that, I will close, because that is how surfboards helped save the red-cockaded woodpecker. I do want to recognize and appreciate all of these individuals that you see listed here who shared not only their stories, but pictures and publications and everything else to make all of this happen, and a great appreciation for everything they contributed. So with that, how am I even doing on time? Do I blow right through it?
Thank you. We have just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
And we could take some questions from the room, and David will take, maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions. And David, do we have any online? No? Question in the room.
Yes, sir.
What's an artificial cavity?
Okay, question was, what's an artificial cavity? Thank you for asking that. So these birds require drilling into the center of a tree in order to create, similar to, like a nest box, basically a hollow place inside the tree. So unlike bluebirds, red-cockaded woodpeckers won't nest in a nest boxy mount on the outside of a tree. So you can use that for other types of cavity nesters. So they developed this technique where they actually, you'll go up on a rickety little ladder about 30, 40 feet off the ground and take a chainsaw right in front of your face and cut out a rectangle out of the living tree there, slide it out, slide your nest box in, kind of putty around it, take some white spray paint to mimic the sort of the sap trails that the woodpecker leaves behind. And then the woodpeckers, treat it like just any other cavity, and they'll go in there and use it, and that's their place where so one thing I didn't mention is every red-cockaded woodpecker needs their own cavity to roost in at night, and then the group has one of those cavities that's used for their nesting, for laying eggs and such. So these cavities are critical both for keeping the birds alive, for roosting habitat, as well as for breeding. Thank you for the question.
I don't think we have any questions online. One more question in the room?
Can you use the same tree for more than one cavity, or is?
The birds sometimes will, but ideally you don't want to, because it does weaken the tree some.
Yeah.
It depends on the size and the width of the tree, but usually it's just one cavity per
So you need to
tree.
have quite a few trees in the area that are amenable to that treatment.
Absolutely. That's actually one thing about woodpeckers, is that they need multiple cavity trees. So you need a lot, not just a single old growth tree, but you need a lot of old growth trees. And they need anywhere from 75 to 200 acres of longleaf forest in order to forage in, to get enough food. They're foraging on the trunks of these trees. So you need these large blocks of contiguous forests, and the older the trees are in it, the better. And that's one of the reasons they become so rare, is because we cut down too many of those trees.
Okay. Jeff, thank you so much. What an amazing story that has far-reaching impacts, not just to the longleaf pine ecosystem, to so many other ecosystems that it demonstrated an example for. So thank you for all your hard work and documenting this and participating. Thanks for other folks in the room who've been involved with this partnership and all of these successes. Thank you all for attending today. And thanks for the folks on Zoom attending as well. We look forward to seeing you at the next program.
Thank you.
Thank you.